Jordan Webb spent 12 years building a life most people only talk about, one truck that barely started in the winter, long shifts that stretched past midnight, and a reputation strong enough that hospitals trusted him with systems worth millions. The kind of man who didn't need attention because his work spoke louder than anything he could say. The kind of man neighbors relied on and co-workers followed without question, steady, disciplined, predictable in the best way, until one quiet morning when everything he built was taken from him in a matter of minutes. When flashing lights filled his driveway and deputies stepped onto his property with paperwork already prepared. When his wife stood at the doorway crying just enough to be believed, accusing him of something he knew he didn't do. And before he could even process what was happening, cold metal closed around his wrists, and just like that, the life he spent over a decade building began slipping out of his control while someone else waited to take his place inside the very home he paid for. He didn't fight them because there was nothing to fight. No warning, no argument, no sign that anything like this was coming. Just a story already written and handed to the people who showed up to enforce it. And as they placed him in the back of that car, he looked up once, searching her face for something real, something honest. But all he saw was a performance that didn't quite reach her eyes. And within hours of that moment, while he sat in a holding cell trying to understand how his life had turned this quickly, another man was already walking through his front door, stepping into rooms filled with furniture Jordan paid for, touching things that had taken years of sacrifice to afford, living inside a space that was never meant for him. And the truth is, none of it was random, none of it was sudden, because while Jordan was busy building something solid, someone else had been planning something else entirely. But 48 hours later, something shifted, something none of them expected, because the same woman who stood there watching him get taken away, the same one who helped create the story that put him behind bars, would soon be the one making the call, her voice shaking, asking for something she never thought she would need, asking him for help, asking him for mercy. And the question is, what could possibly happen in just 2 days that would force someone who had everything working in her favor to turn around so quickly? What could unravel a plan that seemed so carefully set in motion? And more importantly, what did Jordan realize during those hours alone that changed the outcome completely? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Why would someone risk everything to remove their own husband from a life he built with his own hands? A man like Jordan Webb, who had no history of violence, no record of instability, no pattern that would justify what happened that morning. And yet within hours, the story she told was strong enough to move police into action without hesitation. Strong enough to turn a quiet provider into a suspect before he even had the chance to speak for himself. And the question that lingers is how that story was constructed so convincingly, how every detail seemed to align just enough to push events forward without resistance. Because situations like this don't unfold by accident. They take timing, preparation, and a clear understanding of how quickly perception can replace truth when the right pressure is applied. And while Jordan sat behind a locked door replaying every moment of his marriage, trying to pinpoint where things changed, trying to understand when distance turned into deception, there was something else unfolding outside that he couldn't see, something she assumed would remain hidden long enough for her plan to settle into place. Because what she didn't account for was what Jordan would do once he had time to think. Once the noise faded and the reality of his situation forced him to examine every detail with clarity. And what he realized in those hours wasn't just uncomfortable, it was decisive, because the same patience that helped him build his business was now focused on something far more personal, something that would begin to shift the outcome in a way she never anticipated. Because this wasn't just betrayal, it was calculated. Jordan Webb wasn't the kind of man people noticed when he walked into a room, and that was exactly how he preferred it, because attention never paid the bills, and it never built anything that lasted. So he focused on what mattered, showing up early, leaving late, and doing the kind of work most people avoided, the kind that required patience, precision, and consistency. And over time, that approach turned one truck and a few tools into a company trusted with complex projects that demanded reliability above everything else. Hospitals, contractors, entire teams depended on him to get things right the first time. And he carried that same mindset into his personal life, steady, committed, predictable in the ways that make a household feel secure, every bill handled before it became a problem, every responsibility met without needing to be asked. The kind of man who didn't talk about providing because he was too busy doing it. At home, that same routine became the foundation of everything he believed they were building together. A future that didn't rely on luck but on effort. A house that reflected years of sacrifice, long nights that turned into early mornings, decisions made with discipline rather than impulse. And for a long time, it worked, or at least it looked like it did, because stability can sometimes hide distance when no one is looking closely. And Jordan wasn't looking for problems. He trusted what he had built, trusted the rhythm of his life, trusted that consistency would be enough to hold everything together. But trust, when it goes unchecked, can also leave room for change to happen quietly, without resistance, without confrontation. Cassie, the woman he married, wasn't always distant. She had once been part of that same rhythm, supportive, involved, present in the details that mattered. But over time, something shifted in ways that didn't immediately stand out. Conversations became shorter, responses felt delayed, attention moved elsewhere without explanation, and instead of conflict, there was space. The kind that grows slowly enough to go unnoticed until it's already there. And Jordan, focused on keeping everything running, didn't stop to question it, because nothing had broken yet. Nothing had forced him to see what was changing beneath the surface. And when things don't break loudly, they tend to be ignored. But while he was building something real, something stable and dependable, something that required years of effort to create, something else was quietly falling apart in a way that didn't announce itself, didn't demand attention, didn't trigger alarms. And the truth is, it didn't start with an argument. It didn't begin with confrontation or clear signs of conflict. It started with silence. The kind that replaces conversation, the kind that removes connection without explanation, the kind that creates distance while everything still appears intact. And by the time that silence becomes noticeable, it has already done more damage than anyone realizes. The shift didn't happen all at once, and that's what made it so easy to ignore at first, because nothing about Cassie's behavior looked dramatic enough to raise immediate concern. There were no loud arguments, no obvious signs of conflict, just small changes that blended into daily life. Moments where she seemed distracted, conversations that ended quicker than usual, a phone that was suddenly always within reach, turned face down more often than before. And at first, Jordan didn't question it. Because when you trust someone, you don't look for reasons to doubt them. You assume there's an explanation that makes sense, something temporary, something that will pass. But over time, those small changes began to connect in ways that didn't feel accidental. Patterns forming where there used to be openness, distance replacing familiarity without ever being addressed. She started stepping outside more frequently to take calls, not long enough to draw attention, just long enough to avoid being overheard. And when she returned, there was always a reason ready, always something simple enough to dismiss. But repetition has a way of revealing intention, and even then, Jordan didn't confront her, not because he didn't notice, but because nothing had crossed a line he could clearly define. And that uncertainty kept him still, kept him focused on work, on routine, on the things he could control, while everything else slowly moved beyond his awareness. Because what he didn't see was how deliberate it all was, how every action served a purpose that had already been decided. She wasn't angry. She wasn't reacting. She wasn't caught in some emotional moment that led to bad decisions. She was planning, carefully, quietly, with patience that mirrored his own, but for entirely different reasons. And somewhere within that silence, another person entered the picture, not suddenly, not in a way that would leave obvious traces, but gradually, through conversations that happened when Jordan wasn't around, through meetings arranged at times that wouldn't overlap with his schedule, through a connection built in the spaces he thought were still part of his life. And by the time that connection became something real, something solid enough to act on, it had already been protected from discovery. The man didn't appear in Jordan's world directly. There were no confrontations, no sightings that would force the truth into the open, just a presence that existed outside his line of sight, waiting, observing, stepping closer each time the opportunity presented itself. And Cassie made sure those opportunities were controlled, limited, and intentional, because timing was everything. And when the moment finally came, when everything she had been preparing aligned exactly the way she needed it to. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts, only action that moved quickly enough to prevent interference. And by the time Jordan realized something was wrong, by the time the pieces began to form a picture he could no longer ignore, it was already too late. The morning it happened didn't feel unusual at first, which is what made it so disorienting when everything changed without warning. Jordan Webb had already started his day the same way he always did, up early, focused, moving through routine without hesitation, when the sound of tires outside broke that rhythm just enough to pull his attention toward the window, and within seconds, that quiet start turned into something he couldn't control, flashing lights reflecting off the driveway, doors opening with purpose, footsteps approaching with certainty. And before he could even process why they were there, the knock came, firm, direct, final in a way that didn't leave room for misunderstanding. When he opened the door, he expected a conversation, some kind of explanation, something that would allow him to respond. But there was no space for that, no moment where his side of the story mattered, because the decision had already been made before they arrived. Words were spoken that didn't match anything he recognized, accusations delivered with confidence as if they had already been confirmed. And the more he tried to understand what was happening, the clearer it became that understanding wasn't part of the process, because they didn't ask questions, they didn't pause, they didn't look for clarification. They moved forward with certainty, and within moments, cold metal closed around his wrists, tightening just enough to make everything real in a way that words couldn't. He looked past them once, toward the doorway, toward Cassie, searching for something that would explain this, something that would break through the confusion and replace it with clarity. But all he found was distance, a version of her that felt unfamiliar, controlled, composed in a way that didn't match the situation. And in that moment, the realization didn't come all at once. It settled in slowly, piece by piece, as he was guided away from the house he had built, away from the life he thought was stable, into the back of a car where every second stretched longer than the last. Because there's a certain kind of shock that comes from being accused, but there's a deeper one that comes from knowing the person behind it is someone you trusted without question. By the time the doors closed behind him at the station, the noise had faded into something distant, replaced by silence and the weight of what had just happened. And sitting there, alone with nothing but time to think, he started replaying everything, not just the morning, but the weeks before it, the changes, the distance, the patterns he had ignored. And as those details began to connect, a different kind of understanding took shape, one that didn't rely on what he was being accused of, but on why it had been done in the first place. Because this wasn't random, it wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate, timed, executed in a way that removed him from his own life quickly enough to make space for something else. And while he sat in that cell, trying to make sense of a situation designed to keep him in the dark, someone else was already stepping into the life he had just been forced out of, walking through the front door without hesitation, moving through rooms filled with things Jordan had worked years to provide, settling into a space that had never belonged to him. And the most unsettling part wasn't just that it was happening. It was how easily it seemed to unfold, how quickly everything shifted. Once Jordan was out of the way, as if the plan had been waiting for exactly this moment to begin. Time moves differently when everything familiar has been taken away. And for Jordan Webb, those first hours inside that cell stretched far beyond what the clock could measure, because once the noise of the arrest faded, all that remained was silence and the weight of unanswered questions. And in that silence, his mind began to do what it had always done best: organize, analyze, connect details that once felt insignificant into something clearer, something harder to ignore. Moments he had dismissed started to resurface with new meaning. Conversations that felt incomplete, the distance in Cassie's voice, the way she had started guarding her phone, the timing of everything aligning too precisely to be accidental. And as those pieces came together, the confusion that filled his thoughts earlier began to shift into something else, something more focused, more grounded in logic than emotion. That's when everything started to make sense, not in a way that brought comfort, but in a way that removed any remaining doubt about what had actually happened. Because once you step back and look at the full picture without distraction, patterns reveal themselves in ways they never could before. And Jordan realized that none of this had been sudden, none of it had been impulsive. It had been built slowly, carefully, with intention that relied on him staying exactly who he was, consistent, trusting, focused on providing, because that version of him would never see it coming. And that realization didn't break him, it steadied him, because once you understand the structure of something, you begin to see where it can fail. Outside those walls, while Jordan was reconstructing the truth piece by piece, Cassie was already moving forward as if nothing could stop what she had set in motion. The house no longer felt like a shared space. It became something else entirely, a place where decisions were made quickly, where the presence of another man was no longer hidden, where routines shifted to accommodate a new reality that was supposed to replace the old one completely. Money that had been earned through years of disciplined work was now being used without hesitation, without the same restraint that built it, and for a moment, it all seemed to be working exactly the way she intended, as if removing Jordan from the equation had solved every problem she believed existed. But plans that rely on control often overlook one critical detail: the assumption that nothing will interrupt the sequence once it begins, and that assumption is where things start to unravel. Because while Cassie believed everything was secure, while she moved forward with confidence that the situation was under her control, there was one detail she failed to account for, one element she underestimated completely. And it wasn't something dramatic or obvious. It was something far more subtle, something rooted in the very qualities she had taken for granted in Jordan. And that oversight, small as it seemed at first, would become the point where everything began to shift in a direction she could no longer manage. Because in those same 48 hours where she believed she had gained control, she had also made one mistake. Jordan Webb had always approached problems the same way: step back, remove emotion, and focus on what could be proven. And sitting in that cell gave him something he rarely had before: uninterrupted time to think clearly, to trace events without distraction, to separate what was said from what actually happened. And once he began doing that, the structure of the accusation started to show cracks. Small inconsistencies that didn't align with his routines, timelines that didn't match his movements, details that only worked if no one looked too closely. And that's where his advantage began, because while the story against him relied on speed and urgency, his response relied on precision and patience, and those two approaches don't hold up the same way under scrutiny. He started asking questions through the only channels available to him, requesting records, verifying timelines, focusing on facts that couldn't be adjusted or reinterpreted, and one by one, those facts began to contradict the version of events that had put him there. Locations didn't line up, transactions revealed activity that raised new concerns, and more importantly, the timing of certain actions outside his control started to expose something deeper than a simple accusation, something that pointed toward intention rather than reaction. And once those details reached the right people, the certainty that had moved so quickly against him began to slow down, replaced by hesitation, by doubt, by the need to look again. Because the truth doesn't stay buried, especially when someone starts asking the right questions. And what Cassie didn't expect was that the same discipline she once relied on in Jordan would become the very thing that challenged everything she had set in motion. She assumed the situation would overwhelm him, that confusion would keep him passive, that the system would move too quickly for him to respond effectively. But instead, it forced him into a position where clarity became his only option. And once that clarity took hold, it didn't just defend him, it began to turn the situation around in a way she could no longer control. Because the moment doubt enters a story built on certainty, everything starts to shift. And for the first time since that morning, the balance began to move back in his favor. It didn't fall apart all at once. It happened in stages, the kind that start quietly before turning into something impossible to control. Because once doubt entered the situation, it spread faster than Cassie could contain. Questions that hadn't been asked before were suddenly being raised. Details she assumed would go unnoticed were now being examined closely, and the version of events she relied on began to lose its stability. And outside, the confidence she carried in those first hours started to fade, replaced by urgency, by the realization that things were no longer moving in the direction she expected. And when control begins to slip, people reveal who they are under pressure, and in her case, that pressure came quickly, faster than she was prepared for. The man who had stepped into Jordan's space was no longer part of something that felt secure, Because situations built on deception rarely hold when scrutiny increases, and as attention shifted, so did the dynamics inside that house. Tension replacing comfort, uncertainty replacing confidence, and the environment that once felt like an opportunity began to feel like a mistake, one that couldn't be undone as easily as it had been created, and Cassie found herself facing consequences she hadn't planned for, outcomes she didn't anticipate, and a reality that was no longer aligned with what she thought would happen once Jordan was removed. Inside, Jordan didn't need to raise his voice or force anything into motion, because by the time the truth started to surface, the situation was already correcting itself, and when the call finally came, it wasn't controlled, it wasn't calculated, it was immediate, emotional, stripped of the certainty she once had, her voice unsteady, words coming faster than she could organize them, asking for help, asking him to intervene, to stop what was now unfolding beyond her control. And in that moment, the balance that had shifted earlier became undeniable, because 48 hours later, the same woman who set him up, the same one who stood there as he was taken away without hesitation, was now the one reaching out, asking him to fix what she broke. Jordan Webb didn't raise his voice when he heard her. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to respond, because by that point, something inside him had already settled into a kind of clarity that didn't need emotion to guide it. The same patience that built his life now shaped how he handled its collapse. And as Cassie spoke, as the urgency in her voice revealed everything she had tried to control slipping beyond her reach, he understood something that took years to fully see, that the truth about people isn't revealed when things are easy. It shows itself when there's something to gain, something to lose, and no one watching closely enough to question it. And in those moments, decisions are made that define everything that follows, not just for the situation, but for the people involved. Because sometimes betrayal doesn't destroy you. It doesn't end everything the way it feels like it will in the beginning. Instead, it strips away what was never real to begin with. It forces clarity where there was once assumption, and it replaces comfort with understanding. And that understanding, while difficult, becomes something stronger than what existed before, because it's built on truth rather than belief. And for Jordan, that truth didn't come all at once. It formed piece by piece. Through silence, through observation, through moments where everything slowed down enough for him to see clearly what had been happening all along. And when everything settled, when the noise faded and the situation reached its outcome, what remained wasn't just the memory of what happened. It was the awareness of how easily trust can be misplaced when it isn't examined, how quickly stability can shift when it's taken for granted, and how important it is to recognize the signs that something isn't right before they grow into something irreversible. Because the real question isn't just about what happened to him, it's about what anyone in that position would have noticed, what details might have stood out sooner, what silence might have meant if it had been understood differently. And the real question is, would you have seen it coming? What would you have done if you were in Jordan Webb's position? If everything you built over years was taken from you in a single morning without warning, without a chance to defend yourself, and the person responsible was someone you trusted without hesitation, would you have stayed calm and focused the way he did, or would anger have taken over before you had the chance to see the situation clearly? And more importantly, do you think what happened in the end was enough to call it justice? Or do you believe there should have been consequences that went further than what unfolded? Because situations like this don't just raise questions about one decision. They challenge how far accountability should really go when trust is broken at that level. And if you think this story was shocking, if you believe this was as far as things can go when deception meets opportunity, the next story will take that idea even further, because what happens when the truth doesn't surface in time, when the person being targeted never gets the chance to connect the pieces the way Jordan did, and the outcome moves in a completely different direction. That's a story that changes everything you think you understand about trust, timing, and the cost of ignoring the signs.